And I believe we're live. Nice. Hello to anyone watching YouTube, except for me. I want to do a test comment now because it didn't work last time. Okay, that seems to be working. Someone's complaining that they couldn't comment on YouTube last time for whatever reason. But the main issue is that 2 weeks ago, I had left the forced mute everyone else on because I think someone kept on muting themselves and I could hear rustling in the background. Is the reason for that. But it's all okay now. There's a slight light on my face. I might put contact lenses on if I need to. But except for that, feels good. So we wait for people to trickle in. I hope people might be able to. 1 second. Ask the questions that they couldn't ask 2 weeks ago now. That would be a nice way to fill up our 10-minute slot. But some of us they couldn't come, so maybe it won't be an issue. Or who knows? I'll find out together. We'll see. 8 minutes to kick off. Talk is kind of a precursor to 2 weeks' time, because the next talk will be on, I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to phrase it just yet, but how can people who own other people claim to be fighting for freedom when they break off from the UK? I think I should change my light slightly. This is the real content everyone signed up for, right? Boink. Should be slightly better. No difference at all. That's excellent. Oh well. It's fine. As you have 8 minutes to kick off, no one's tried to join but been unable, right? Yes. 7 minutes to go. This one should be a fun one, I hope. And well, fun, interesting, at least. Focusing in on Black British America. I'll be a bit, yeah, I apologize for the lateness of the email beforehand, but what can you do? I've been very busy with other stuff. My master's is accelerating in things to do. And I was actually possibly saying this to no one. I claim to have 2 viewers on YouTube. I know one of which is me, but I'm not sure. Not even 3 of which are me. If you're watching YouTube, say hi. I'm monitoring the chat. I'll see if it works. A test message succeeded. But, maybe it's not working. I don't know how YouTube works. I'm far from an expert. And I'm also watching there as well. Yeah, I feel like I'm missing out on some vamping material. Normally I have a lot more to say in the first 6 minutes. I guess people aren't dropping in to say hi, so I can't say hi back. Not that there's any issue with that at all. People joining in. Hello, I'm gonna pin myself.
Hello, Lucas.
Hello. Did you have a question from 2 weeks ago that you want to ask now, by any chance?
Yes, but I can't remember it.
That's all right. To be expected. Yes, we're talking about the first ever African Americans. That was the theme.
Yeah.
About the origins of the slave trade and some revolts and communications and networks between Africans and Americans, indigenous Americans, that is, that kind of stuff.
Okay, maybe after we've had today's talk, some of the questions.
Yeah, maybe it will spark up again. Yeah.
Yes.
That's all right. Hey. Yeah, this is a bit similar from last time. Just kind of focusing on specifically British America because the rest of the series will be in the US mostly. We'll be like, yeah, diving into British colonial America, whereas last time was quite general. Who were the first people to go to the Americas at all? You know, that kind of thing. So there should be some similar themes and possibly similar discussion that we were so cruelly robbed of last time.
By the way, I have to tell you that I find it very interesting, very, very interesting. Something I've never, well, I've read some novels about slaves, but never actually read any history about them. Yeah. So I find it very interesting.
That was the idea behind this whole series, is that it's possible. I had to really work hard to be able to study this kind of stuff at uni, as in like pick out specific modules, to not just do British political blah 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 blah. So it was I think it's really fascinating. I want to share that with as many people as possible. That's the goal of what we're doing today. And more people are trickling in, which is lovely. Good to see. Hello and welcome.
So are you going to mute us?
Yes, I've worked out what went wrong last time. Don't worry.
And then you'll unmute us after.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's great. Great. Yeah. You know, we're a very talkative bunch, Lucas. So
indeed. It's all good. Let me just share my screen up with the presentation. Get the old logo going. Welcome all who are joining now. Say hi if you're there on YouTube, or maybe the comments are broken on YouTube. I'm not sure. I could comment, but maybe no one else can. I don't know how it works. It's fine. But welcome. Is that working on YouTube as well? Yes, good. With 3 minutes to go. And people coming in. Yeah, I said this before when there were a few people around. If you had a question 2 weeks ago, but I forgot to, I did a setting wrong basically, and so people couldn't ask questions using the voice. If you had any questions from last time that you were unable to ask, okay, someone successfully done a test comment, so that works too. Wonderful. If you have any questions, or if you want to ask me anything new now, that's fine. It doesn't have to be a question from 2 weeks ago. In the last couple of minutes before we kick off, feel free to ask that too. I'm checking out both chats and everything. As people join us, it's a decent-sized crowd this time around. There's slightly more on Zoom than YouTube, so a Zoom gang are winning the winning the race by a thin margin. But I think I just accidentally muted someone. That's all right. And with 1 minute to go, I'm excited. I've got my notes all ready. And this is now, yeah, all this stuff. I'm actually pulling up my notes from my undergrad career, and that's good to see some use out of them again. These like massive 10,000 page Word documents that I was worried I'd never see the light of day once I handed in my final essays on these modules. But that's all right. Finally, we're getting some use out of them. Okay. With 1 minute to go, dare I start slightly early? Is that even legal? I hope so, because I'm probably going to do it. Actually, no, people are still coming in, and as long as they are, I need to be clicking buttons, so I can't be focusing fully on the talk. But that's fine too. And gosh, yeah, Zoom is doing much better than YouTube. I'll see if I can bump those numbers up in future. It's fine, as long as there's people watching, I'm happy. Well, it just got even. Anyway, the time is past, so we can begin with this talk 2 now. We had 0 and 1, which will be focusing on were there opportunities for Africans in British America, and more specifically, what was life like for people of African origin in British America? As we start talk 2. And I'm actually just going to mute everyone real quick, although you can still unmute yourselves, but please don't just yet, until afterwards. So this will be a talk in 3 parts, as I like to do them from now. And the first part will be locating us geographically and temporally. So where and when we're going to be discussing what we're analyzing. And then we're going to look at what the experiences were of both enslaved and free Black people in British America. And in fact, the picture we have here is of a Mr. James Fulton, who was a wealthy Philadelphia businessman who was born free in British America. And we'll talk about that kind of story a little bit. And then we're going to have a look at what this means for the future of America and almost set the ground a little bit for what will come next, which will be the American Revolution. And the first thing that I want to really emphasize here is this idea that was of 3 layers to the map. And when we have a map like this one, I think this one was made by John Smith, the secondary main character of the Disney film Pocahontas, I suppose. He did a lot of other stuff as well. He was an explorer in America, and I think it was him who made this map. And there are 3 sides to it. The first side is the kind of most basic viewing. And when you look at a map, any map in the world, it's the side that you see. And it's where the lines are drawn of where the countries are. And if you look up, and there's one that appears a little bit later, a map of European claims on the Americas, you'll see these kind of maps. They've got big straight lines all over them. And there's blank space where Europeans haven't claimed the land. It's just empty. Who knows who might live there? I don't know, certainly. And there's no holes in or anything. It's very contiguous. You know, it goes Dutch claim, British claim, French claim right next to it, and they all line up and are very neat. Beneath that, or not really beneath that, alongside that is the Black layer to the map, if you will, because the Black communities that lived in the Americas in this time almost inhabited different worlds, right? Certainly in British America, they were very segregated from the white populations. There wasn't much intermingling or mixing at all. And so they would often speak different language, might worship a different religion, they would do different work. And even though they had lived in very close geographic proximity to their white counterparts, and unfortunately in many cases masters, they would effectively have another layer to the map of where the Black communities are located within this broad ranging. This is British colonial America, this is French, and so on. And then the final layer, and this is a lecture series that focuses primarily on Black history of America, but it's so, you really can't ignore the indigenous side of things, is the indigenous part of it. And that is really addresses any map you see that has blank spaces. People live almost everywhere that it's possible for people to live, in fact. And so these blank spaces are often, in fact, inhabited. And we have the groups in British America, the Narragansett, Algonquian language groups, the Haudenosaunee, a bit further inland, the Ojibwe. There are dozens, hundreds, if not thousands of different indigenous groups that populated this area before Europeans arrived, while they were living there, and still to this day, unsurprisingly. And they are, in some respects, hard to see because often they aren't given borders at all in some maps. In this one, they are present. You can see Powhatan, who is the Algonquian chief or leader. Chief has baggage that we don't necessarily like, but he was in charge of a bunch of people of the Algonquian language group. And we have another figure, I think there's a name given possibly, with a bow and a club. And another thing that's worth mentioning is that often indigenous people are kind of represented as part of nature. I think in Christopher Columbus's diaries, it talks about how they encountered big waves, terrible storms, snakes, and Indians, right? And that's the thing to just, I know this isn't the focus, but it's a point I think is worth making. There are 3 layers to the map, and the indigenous people are people, as is everyone else. And that's the kind of basic idea that I want us to take with, to hold with us as we go through the rest of this talk, because we need to start zooming in, because where we started last time was just the Atlantic world, which is what I'm showing here. And there are 3 important parts of the Atlantic world for this discussion. You can see off in the corner, Europe is tucked away, and obviously Europe is very important in the history of the Atlantic world. But for our purposes, we have 3 parts: West Africa, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Americas, because everyone who was black in the New World in this period was either born in Africa or their ancestors were born in Africa and they were brought across the Atlantic into the New World. And we talked about this a lot last time, so really we're just reframing the discussion. But we have people coming from primarily West Africa, so the Sierra Leone Basin, the Gulf of Guinea, that region, and also a bit further south, the Angola Basin, the Bight of Biafra, that kind of region. And we are talking about millions of people. There are no very accurate estimates for how many people were brought across the Atlantic. The lowest estimate I've seen is around 6 million, and the highest is around 12 million, which goes to show how wide the margin of error is. It is as large as the lowest guess possible, right? We really don't know the exact numbers at all of how many people were brought across. Certainly it was millions, enough to severely depopulate the areas left behind. That is a point worth mentioning. And the people were brought across the Atlantic Ocean, and in recent scholarship, so in the last maybe even 30 years, people are beginning to rethink of the Atlantic Ocean, what was called the Middle Passage, as a place of history in its own right. Because a lot of things happen in this region. It's a place of violence and of escape and of movement and of travel and of people becoming enslaved and being made free again later. After in the year 1807, when the British Empire makes the slave trade illegal, the Royal Navy starts boarding slave ships and forcibly liberating the people aboard them. And so a lot of things happen, and now that's kind of just to clue you in on the new hot trends. That's the thing that's happening in historiography at this time. But the ultimate end for almost all of these people, not all, but most of these people, the vast majority, was to arrive in the New World. And most of the people who were enslaved and brought across the Atlantic Ocean arrive in Brazil and Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean. Comparatively, very, very few end up in what is now the USA. Only about, I think, 0.5%, maybe 5%, sorry, around 500,000 people end up in what is now the USA, which is really, compared to the, like the people that end up in Brazil or in Cuba or in what is now Haiti, really small numbers. And we're going to talk about why that is. But when we zoom in a little bit further and we look at British colonial America, there are two parts of that. There's the Caribbean part and the continental part, which is a thing that's unusual, is that now, so the British Caribbean, which is now the countries Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, St. Kitts and Nevis, all these kinds of places, economically and politically, militarily, they are comparatively insignificant compared to the US. It's kind of harsh to say, but it's true. The US is very wealthy and powerful. But in the time period we're talking about, the Caribbean islands were the heart and the soul in almost every sense of the European control of America, certainly economically. Almost all the money flowing back across the Atlantic to the New World came from the Caribbean, excuse me. So when we talk about the British colonial America, early America is what some American scholars call it. I don't love that phrase because it kind of makes things seem inevitable in a way that I don't really like. But when we talk about that period, we should really be aware that this is like the northern periphery compared to the real heart of the Spanish Main, the region of the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Atlantic Ocean. To answer the question briefly of why was it the case that so few people went to America? In fact, even though there are only, say, 500,000 brought there over the entire period, now in the last US census, I think some 31 million Americans identified as Black. Something's different, right? And that's because the death rate in other European powers and in the Caribbean, in their colonies in the New World, was extraordinarily high. In some cases, your life expectancy, if you went to, say, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, would be less than 2 years. Really, really, they would work you to death very, very quickly. This is not to say that slavery in the British Americas was nice or benevolent or anything like that. It was bad. It just wasn't as bad as further south and in the French, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies. So there's some comparison to be had there. But the place that we're really talking about is the 13 colonies, which I'll now list for you from north to south very quickly. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And they'll be the focus of most of what we're talking about today. And there is a further split that's important as we zoom in even more. And that is geographically, and in many other ways as well, between the North and the South, because we now in the modern world think of there being quite a big distinction between the North of the US and the South. And in fact, they had a little war a couple of hundred years ago. And surprise, surprise, we're going to talk about that weeks down the line. But it is definitely true that this division between the North and the South started a very long time ago. As you can see from this map, which shows you when these regions were colonized, it was the northernmost parts that were colonized first. And this is because they were closer to Britain, is the easiest answer. As you can see, there's that kind of tilt outwards. When you look at Britain, it's around the same level as Massachusetts, roughly, maybe even slightly further north than that. Britain's actually quite high on the hemisphere. And so when they came in, it was Canada and New England were the first places to be colonized. So this meant that these places developed urban centers first. Now there's also a sharp geographical divide between the North and the South. The North has far bigger forests and mountains. It's got much more topographical interest, whereas the South is characterized by wider flat plains, marshes and swamps in some cases. It's much more flat and much hotter, and the soil is much richer in many cases as well. This means that the South had prime soil for growing cash crops. Tobacco, indigo, coffee, and in the later period, cotton were major exports, and that's the way that the South made its money. Meanwhile, the North, much more in terms of like mercantile, consumerism, capitalist culture, rather than the more rural agrarian style, although you can argue, and some historians have, that there was agrarian capitalism happening. I don't want to drag you into that really complicated debate too early. But there were cities. You see urban centers develop in the North that weren't true in the South. In the North, people were moving to New England to start a new life because they are fleeing religious persecution or they are fleeing political instability. There's a massive uptick in immigration to New England during the 1630s. If you know anything about British history in the 17th century, you'd know why. There's like an English Civil War about to happen back home, so everyone's fleeing and they're going to the New World. In the South, people are going to make money, effectively. And that means that there is a demographic change as well. In the North, there are indentured servants, but in the South, indentured servants, usually, when they're not African, when they're Irish or British, they were going there to make a new life or because they're fleeing the law or something like that. And indentured servants would tend to not want to do plantation labor because it's horrible. You have to work all day in the sun and it's very hard work and you can't eat the food that you grow because you're not growing food. And that kind of stuff is long hours. It's terrible. And so where there were plantations, there was a demand for enslaved labor because you could compel someone to work in a job that no one wants to do. And so in the South, you see many, many, many more enslaved people because there is the possibility of growing these cash crops that just isn't true in the North. This is not to say that there was no slavery in the North. There was some, but around 2% of white Northerners by 1780 were slaveholders, while in the South, it's around 25%, much, much more slavery going on in the South. And the result also meant that the laws changed as well. You would think, I think with good reason, that one framework could be if you see Black people around you all the time, then you would realize that they're people just like you and you'd have more liberal laws. Well, actually, the opposite happened in these regions where there were large Black populations, particularly in the Carolinas, where in some cases there were even more Black than white people. The white slaveholding class would become terrified of revolt because there were so many around. And so they got much stricter laws, much harsher penalties for breaking them, and defined the slavery along much harsher racial lines. For example, in Virginia, in I think 1680, as I said last time, very briefly, it became law that if you were Black, you were a slave. If you were white, you were free. They defined slavery along racial lines. In the North, you have much more enslaved and free Black people living in harmony, well, not in harmony, but in the same societies as each other. And so opinion begins to shift more towards freedom in the North, even though the first colony to make laws that legalize slavery was Massachusetts in 1640. So it's not as simple as North good, South bad, but there are reasons for the different processes that culminated in there being more instances of slavery in the South and fewer in the North. So we should talk about the rise and fall of slavery and the slave trade, because this is actually, as I said last time, I think, briefly, expanding on this more, quite a brief thing. Initially, so back in these first colonies in the kind of before 1660, even starting in 1617 was the first one in Jamestown in Virginia, and Roanoke as well. These colonies did very, very poorly. They were funded by private enterprise, which means that they were often underfunded and poorly supplied. And they were often unable to grow enough food for them to live in the 1620s and 30s. You get what's called the starving time. And there are reports of the colonies either collapse or they are forced to sell everything they own to Native American people to get food to live. There are reports of cannibalism as well, and it's not very often talked about, but there is archaeological evidence to support it, because obviously no one wants to admit to doing it. It seems there was cannibalism going on. And so these colonies weren't very prosperous. But by the late 17th century, so the 1670s and 80s, these private organizations have largely collapsed, and they've been taken over by the British Crown, who then pump in much more goods into them and people as well. And they then start to become profitable. And once they become profitable, people realize if we, take land off the Native Americans, then there's actually huge amounts of land compared to these very small islands in the Caribbean. North American continent is vast. So there's lots of soil that we can grow crops on. And that means that as demand surges in Europe, as people start getting hooked on coffee and tobacco, right? These are addictive substances. So demand only spikes and spikes and spikes. At the same time, the British Crown breaks the monopoly that the Royal African Company had on its ability to enslave people in Africa, which means suddenly much more corporations start appearing. So the supply of enslaved Africans increases as well. So there's the supply of soil. There's this massive boom in slave trading and slavery that takes place all across the Atlantic. And we see this all over the Atlantic world, but it's no different in British America as well. And there's this, and suddenly tens and even hundreds of thousands of people are being brought across the Atlantic, straight from Africa to America, where previously they'd often go from Africa to the Caribbean, spend some time there, and then be bought by Americans. There's a direct line that we start seeing appear across the Atlantic. But it is not as simple. There are like various wrong ways to think about the response and resistance to slavery, because there are, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this properly. One wrong way of thinking about it is that we begin with slavery legal and slavery happening everywhere. And then it slowly gets more and more illegal and tapers off, and now there's no slavery. That is a wrong way of thinking about it, because in the very early days of the colonies, we had indentured labor happening to black and white people, not slavery. And then slavery becomes a thing and becomes very large, and then gets pulled back, clawed back over the course of decades and even centuries. At the same time, there are other responses to it as well, because Britain never made laws, unlike Spain or France, for complicated reasons. Britain never made laws that legalized slavery in the first place. And in fact, in 1569, so a very long time ago, a court ruled that English law cannot recognize slavery, because there's things about English liberty is like this very important foundational aspect of British culture. This didn't stop Brits from doing the slave trade and selling slaves around in other places, and nor did it really stop them doing it in Britain either. It gets quite confusing, because in 1701, the Lord Chief Justice rules that enslaved people become free when they set foot on English soil because of the law, but it can still happen in the colonies. In the case of Smith v. Gould in 1705, there's like more precedent added to this, where it says, the ruling says, I quote, "The common law, no man can have property in another," end quote. But then in 1729, the Attorney General and Secretary General signed this opinion called York-Talbot opinion, that says that the slavery of Africans is lawful in England. And while they're signing that opinion, there is slave trade happening on the ground in like Liverpool. So even if it's technically illegal, it's still happening because no one's really bringing it up into court. So that's very confusing. And then there's another ruling, Shanley v. Harvey in 1763, that says, quote, "As soon as a man sets foot on English ground, he is free," end quote. And groups like the Quakers, for example, as well as obviously the people who are being enslaved themselves, they're fighting hard against it the entire time. We're going to talk about slave resistance in a second. But from the like legalistic political side of things, groups like the Quakers are fighting against it, saying it's immoral. And there becomes this understanding that basically it's very, very hard to legally justify slavery, obviously, because it's awful. And so there is a case, a very important case that happens in 1772 of the Crown versus Knowles, ex parte Somerset. And what happens is a man called John Somerset, who is an enslaved person born into slavery in America. And he is owned by a clerk in Boston. And the clerk takes him to Britain for a business trip, I believe. And John obviously immediately runs away, like as soon as possible. And he is eventually recaptured and put on a ship heading back to Jamaica to be re-enslaved. At which point, 3 Quaker abolitionists, claiming to be his godparents, take the slave owners to court, arguing that this is illegal. Once he set foot in Britain, he was free. And the court ruling says, I'm going to summarize this quote a little bit, quote, of the institution of slavery, quote, "It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Whatever inconveniences, therefore, may follow from the decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged," end quote. So the law says over this period that slavery bad. Meanwhile, in America, they're making slavery more and more legal. So it's this very complicated process of the 2 parallel sides of pro-slavery and anti-slavery, and they're moving along next to each other. And sometimes one side wins, and sometimes another side wins. It's not as simple as anything swinging back and forth in any kind of one-dimensional direction. And while this is all happening, and more people are being brought to America, we are seeing a developing and burgeoning African-American culture. And there are it's really worth calling it, rather than black culture, African-American, because those are the 2 parts that make it up. There are some elements brought from Africa, for example, in material culture. Literally, the plant's the gourd, which is this plant that you can't eat, but if you grow it and dry it, you can use it like a bowl. That plant is native to West Africa, and we see it start appearing in the Americas as literally people brought seeds with them and then planted gourds and used them. So that's like the most basic material culture. But also a really important case study. Religion is important as well, right? And we see a combination and a mishmash of, for example, West African religions like voodoo, Vodun, being brought across, and then also Christianity being imposed on enslaved people who live in the Americas. A famous saying about Haiti, for example, is that it's 85% Roman Catholic, 15% Protestant, and 100% voodoo. But millions of people to this day in the Americas practice voodoo as a religion. And a good case study to talk about these things is music, because we get, for example, a lot of instruments come across from Africa into American usage, such as the drums and the zithers and the xylophone and banjos, for example. We think that's kind of maybe even like a hillbilly instrument, but that came from West Africa originally, the banjo. And we see that being merged in with Christian music, gospels and spiritual songs and stuff, until we eventually end up with African American music. And we're going to talk a lot about African American music throughout the rest of this period because it's really interesting. And there's a lot of really interesting things to talk about it, but we're seeing it appear right at the very earliest stages here. And we often get songs like, for example, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, just for some reason and somehow become like an English rugby song. But the lyrics are originally talking about basically dying and being free from the horrible life of being enslaved. And that's a common theme in the music as well, of like singing about better times and better places, as an example. But that's really, there's a lot of developing African-American culture in this period. I suppose that's a kind of thriving opportunity, right? And we'll see that as we keep going. Lastly, there is an important point to make about resistance and revolt. Of course, we talked about the legalistic Quakers in Britain and the abolitionists who were saying we should stop this, but we should also talk about what was happening on the ground in America itself. And it is true that compared to other parts of the Americas, there were comparatively few major slave revolts in the Americas. The biggest one probably ever was Nat Turner's slave revolt, where hundreds of people were involved. Hundreds, not thousands like there were in other places. And there's interesting reasons for this. The historian Eugene Genovese has what he gives us 8 conditions for slave revolt to happen. I'm going to run you through them very quickly and then talk about them as they apply to America now. The black population is much larger than the white population. There are relatively large slaveholding units, suitable geographical terrain. African-born slaves are more numerous than New World-born slaves. Owner absenteeism, conflict within the ruling class, economic distress and famine, and the social structure of the slaveholding regime permitted the emergence of an autonomous black leadership. The last one is really, really complicated, and we'll talk about that for other stuff, don't worry. But to apply the first few to America. Firstly, there were only 2 states where black population was ever larger than the white population. That was the Carolinas, and even then it was like less than 60% black. So we have a bare majority, which means that when there was insurrection, it was able to be suppressed very quickly by like lots of white people. There were not relatively large slaveholding units. Only about a quarter of enslaved people worked on plantations of 50 people or more. You were seeing smaller families, like 25 people on a plantation, unlike these massive industrial scale ones in San Domingo, where there's like hundreds, if not thousands of people who are working in the same place and so can conspire together, right, obviously. Suitable geographical terrain, the wide, flat, open plains of America are not good for hiding, unlike the high hills of Haiti or Jamaica. There were not African-born slaves more numerous because the death rate was lower, which means that people were being born into slavery and then spending their entire lives in it. When you haven't lived your first few lives in freedom, it's much harder to imagine what that's like, and so to fight for it, it's very unfortunate. So people almost had their will more broken by the fact that they're being born into it, rather than being free people taken over to the Americas. Finally, final few, owners were tended to be more present because they were living in America rather than being Europeans who owned land in the New World. And there was less conflict within the ruling class of the Americas until the Revolution. And we'll talk about the Revolution as well next time. So there is this myth of passivity from enslaved people in America. And there are speeches given by American politicians after Nat Turner's revolt that talks about how the enslaved person is comparatively docile. And that was not true. We do see small scale uprisings and revolts and resistance throughout this entire period. But it is certainly true that in general, there are fewer major large scale uprisings than in other parts of the Americas. But the reasons for that obviously isn't that like the people were worse. It's for all the obvious reasons that we've given above. So, and obviously there are cases of major large scale revolts that we'll talk about in future. So what can we conclude from all this stuff? First off, there's big variation, not only over the New World as a whole, nor even over British American world as a whole, from the continent to the Caribbean, but also almost like, within the 13 colonies, there's vast variation on how people lived and how they were treated and what kind of laws govern their lives. And we should accept those changes and distinctions, and we'll keep them with us going forward. There's no homogenous group, or there's no like one opinion shared by all enslaved people, except maybe, I'd like to be free. But even then, well, yeah, quite likely, actually, yeah, probably. And another thing that we want to conclude from this is that, as I said before, we don't want to be, historians hate calling things inevitable, with good reason, I'd like to think. And neither the development of slavery in the New World, nor its decline are inevitable. And there were people fighting back and forth for it right up until it finished in America. Well, at least partly finished in America in 1864. And the final point is, and I've touched upon this a few times, is we are laying the groundwork for what's going to happen next time. You may have noticed that the last court case I talked about was 1772. The American War of Independence begins in 1776. And while Britain's moving towards freedom, obviously not 100%, but the legalistic side of things is moving towards freedom, the Americans are moving towards more slavery. And these two forces in motion are about to collide next time. We're going to talk about the American Revolution in the future, but we can see the roots of how this is happening, where the economic and like political conditions are there, where they are not there in Britain. And now I'd like to ask if there are any questions anyone has about the stuff we've talked about so far. I timed that quite well. And yeah, I think you can unmute yourselves if you so desire. Yeah, I think you can. And ask. Follow, you've got your hand up. You can also post it in chat if you want, however you want to ask questions.
No, it's quite too much of a chat. So what I wanted to clarify is, I think it was James Somerset. You said he was brought to the UK, but he escaped. But when he was brought, was he not brought over as a? Was he? He wasn't a slave, surely, when he was brought to England. And if so, because that's why I'm a bit confused, because when he got here, I understand that Stuart, that was the case. But I just don't understand how he could escape when he was actually brought. He wasn't brought as a slave, was he?
So it's, yeah, it's a really good question. And it's very, there's a lot of really like lack of clarity here, where often people would be there's like three different things going on at the same time. One is that often the law doesn't directly correlate to what's happening on the ground, right? So at the time of that opinion by the Secretary General and Attorney General of Britain, that slavery is legal, there was still legal precedent saying that it was illegal, but also there was slave trading happening on the streets of Britain. And so it's often the case that things would be going on that if they were brought to court would be found as illegal, but they were still often like even enforced on the small scale, right? So there's stuff that happened that would even maybe like local police and like local authorities would enforce that actually on the high scale like was illegal. So that's one side of it. Another side of it is that often people would be enslaved in the New World, and then when they were brought to Britain, they would be classed as like an indentured servant under a contract, and that's how they would be legally treated. And so they could then be like still kept under the control of their master while they're in Britain, even if what effectively was the case was they were in a state of slavery, right? And so that then you get into this really weird legal gray area, and that's basically what I think John Somerset was hoping to exploit when he legged it and escaped his bondage. So it's possible that he was being held in what was effectively slavery, even though it was technically illegal to be happening in Britain. I know for a fact that, for example, when Benjamin Franklin was living in Britain, which he did for a number of years throughout the 18th century, he had two people with him who, if he was in the US, would have been counted as slaves. And yet they were called servants in Britain. And also one of them ran away as soon as he made it to Britain. So there's a lot, it's really unclear exactly where the law lay and where different precedents applied in different cases and what could be enforced and what couldn't be enforced. I know that's a really unhelpful answer, I'm sorry, but the point is it's really complicated. It's not exactly clear what's going on.
Lucas, I've got a question. Are you saying then that in other matters around that time, what was law in Britain would be law in America as well? Or they had already, or maybe this is not a question for you, maybe it's a question for somebody else legal in the room, but what was the law already diverging? Or was it at that point in that whatever Britain decided was law applied to America as well?
That is another really good question. And so we see this process of legal divergence, basically, over this period. In the very beginning, it is assumed, so when these colonies first are founded, it's assumed that English common law applies to them, right? And I think they were actually under the jurisdiction of London. Their sheriff courts, if you had a really important court case, it would be heard in London, and like the Bishop of London would have religious legal jurisdiction over the New World as well. So they were under those English common laws. But when they became fully fledged colonies, they would write up their own charters, usually based on English common law, but then they could put in their own stuff that would apply to local situations. For example, laws governing how they should interact with indigenous American people. There's nothing in the precedent in Britain about that, but they had to write their own charters and discuss how they were going to do that. And the same goes for their laws concerning slavery. And it's in the kind of throughout the 17th century that we start seeing these charters appear. And for example, when Massachusetts writes its own charter in 1640, they create slavery as a legal institution, which doesn't exist back in Britain at all. So it's like, again, it's this blurry gray area where in some cases they're based on British law, or at least they're based on it, but have their own distinction. But it's not always clear.
Okay, thank you.
So good. I have a couple of written questions. I have one that says, I think on the slide about slave revolts, you had a bullet point about other forms of resistance. I wondered if you had more to say about that. Yes, I had, I think we kind of talked about it last time, so I didn't go into too much detail this time, but to briefly run through the kinds of things that were happening, of which there are many. A few examples of the types of resistance that would happen would be, so these are like not open revolt, trying to kill your masters and then like break free and run off into the hinterlands and live as a free person, which obviously did happen sometimes. But we're seeing other things like just doing your work really slowly to spite your master, or pretending to be ill is a classic, or not fighting but running away, or breaking your tools, or sabotaging production, or literally just nicking stuff. Nicking stuff was really common because if legally you were property and so was like, I don't know, this tub of like chicken meat, then I think as Frederick Douglass put it, you're taking the master's meat out of one tub and putting it in another. So how can it be a crime? So these enslaved people were able to argue that actually they had a legal right to steal stuff from the master and eat it because, you know, where's the crime there? Which I find quite funny, maybe not. So there's all kinds of different things that people would do to fight back in some sense against the people in charge of their lives. I have another question, which is, this looks like an interesting one too. So are you saying the differences between the UK and the US towards slavery at that time are mainly geographical, open spaces and cash crops, rather than anything to do with the people concerned? So that is a really good question. I'm gonna take a sip of water before I answer it. So it's very hard to unpick exactly where the origins of different culture and different legal systems are. But one point that is brought up again and again and again, which I feel is worth drawing out here, is the lack of a large urban poor working class in America in this period and its presence in Britain. Those would almost be the two analogous groups, wherein the US, or what would become the US, their big fear was of slave insurrection, and they put all their most oppressive laws to govern the lives of enslaved people. In the UK, the big fear was the like unwashed masses rising up and trying to overthrow their masters. And so the harshest laws were put in place against them. And this means that there were, it's really hard to phrase it exactly, but you could maybe construct an argument that what you have, we see the same relation between like dominant ruling class and then subservient working class, but almost because they were able to start from scratch in America, they're able to like legally bind enslaved people under their control in in the colonies in a way they couldn't do in Britain. And that's what the kind of one of the architects of colonialism in British America, Richard Hakluyt, he had drawn out these big plans and designs for what the Americas would look like. And there was no place in that for enslaved people, sorry, for large urban poor populations. And that's why, for example, a lot of the American cities were built on grid systems, is to have it all nice and neat and no like sprawling slums, right? It's these same kind of ideas. And so it's hard to say that there were actually massive differences towards the notion of keeping one class of people subservient. What is the case is that in Britain, there was this long-standing tradition of British liberty, which wasn't the case in the US because it was like a new, there's a lot of we see a lot of the dialogue about like being able to create a new society that's ideal. And often the ideal society meant hyper-religious. Boston was founded as like this, you know, city on the hill ready for the second coming, which didn't work. It became a merchant city very quickly. But that included as well the ability to basically enslave and Christianize people from Africa. So I feel like I've answered that question kind of poorly, maybe. But the reason why it's arguable that the reason why slavery became a thing in the US is more to do with the geography and the economics, the cash crops, than it is to do with the ideology. And it's possible that if the same geographical conditions existed in the UK, in Britain, then maybe slavery would have been more of a thing in Britain. But it's certainly unclear. And it's hard to say exactly, like these kind of counterfactuals are always difficult to argue one way or the other, to know who would have, has my camera just turned off? No, one way or another, exactly why things happened, you know. My camera just turned off. I'm gonna try and fix that. But in the meantime, as long as you can still hear me, I can hear you. I'm pretty sure. Oh no, we're back on. Okay, perfect. Does anyone else have any questions at all on YouTube, perhaps, or in Zoom is fine as well. If not, that's okay as well. Because we're kind of coming to the end of our time anyway. I'll talk. Yeah, it's your last chance to think of a question to ask, and that's fine. I will advertise next fortnight's talk instead. Sorry, I just received the email from someone saying they can't write comments for some reason. I don't know what's going on. I've been able to comment, and someone else has as well, but apparently someone else can't. That's really weird. So yeah, I have two things to say. One is that in 2 weeks' time, there will be the next talk will be on the American Revolution, and it will be asking and hoping to answer the question: how is it that the American revolutionaries, most of whom owned slaves, like literally owned people, how they could claim to be fighting for freedom against British oppression, right? How could they say that with like no tinge of irony? That's the question that we're going to try and answer next time. And I think that'll be a really interesting talk. And the American Revolution is always fun to talk about. I'm going to insult the musical Hamilton a lot, which I know is very controversial. So be aware of that. That's going to happen. And the second point I'd like to make out is if you are not watching this live, instead you've caught up on YouTube, well done for making it this far. Congratulations. And if you ask a question, if you comment on the uploaded video, then I will get back to you and write up a response as well. So don't worry about that either. And the same goes for anyone who's watching live. If you can't catch the next one for whatever reason, then you have a question, comment it, and I will write up an answer. Worry not. But with that, I think, unless anyone has any last questions, now is your final chance before I say farewell to everyone. Sorry for everyone watching on YouTube who can't comment. That's really annoying. I'm going to try and fix that in future. Maybe you need an account on YouTube and you don't have one, but everyone has one because if you have an account on Google, you have an account on YouTube. I don't know how it works. So I'll try and sort that by next time. Sorry about that. But thank you very much, everyone, for watching.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you.
And
That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Glad those who found it interesting, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time for the American Revolution.
Brilliant.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
And for some reason, I can't end the Zoom meeting as well. This is fantastic. I was leaving anyway. It's fine.